Morning. It's 8:02 in the east. Do you know where your children are? Here we are. Just straightening out my camera a little bit. So this morning, we're going to be reading in The Unseen Partner by Diane Croft. That's this book. It's a beautiful book about the individuation process. And this book, A Mystical Path Less Traveled, a Jungian psychological perspective. Now, one of my regular followers last week observed correctly that we're actually talking about two sides of the same coin. We're talking about both the Eros side and the Logos side. So as I'm reading the Unseen Partner, I'll show it to you one more time. So I'm reading The Unseen Partner, and this will be the first pages I will read today. On my left side, or I'm sorry, on my right side, your left here, for every topic, there's a poem and an image. And on my left side, your right side, is a quote and then Diane Croft's commentary on it. And it's quite a lovely book. We started with it last week, and it gives you the basics of individuation from a Jungian point of view. And the other book, Mystical Path Less Traveled, is by Jerry Wright. He's a Jungian analyst and a retired Presbyterian minister, but he takes some positions that actually sum up Jungian psychology, things that I had worked out on my own for weeks, or not weeks, years ago, but no one says it explicitly. I've been trying to say it for 10 years on the Archetype in Action website and on this channel, but Jerry Wright has sort of summed up our situation with respect to all the religions of the world. So this is the Logos side, and I'm going to alternate between the two books. And good morning to those of you who joined me. It's always a pleasure to have a few of you with me. So last week we ended with a topic called opposites. And this week I'm beginning in The Unseen Partner, page 16, with dark sounds. And here's the poem. I wait for you as the dark comes, not in form, but with presence. Your holy water anoints me. Aftershocks of your longing cut through me like a foghorn splits the night. Warning of dangers unseen, dark sounds excite my fears, blind to where I'm going, familiar only with where I've been. A virgin trembles. And this is the image that she has. It's called Crepuscular Rays and the Reflection at Mallard Lake, 2008 at Golden Gate Park, San Francisco. So that's the image that comes with this particular segment. And here's the quote from Philo of Alexandria, who is a Jewish biblical philosopher. But when God begins to associate with the soul, he brings to pass that she who was formerly woman becomes virgin again. And so here's Diane's comment. Dark sounds. I wait for you as the dark comes, speaks of the night, a symbol of the unconscious. Ego consciousness longs for union with the deep transpersonal layers of the psyche. But this poem warns of dangers unknown. This is virgin territory. An encounter with the primordial self is both ecstatic and terrifying. Ecstatic because of the erotic passion embedded in these transpersonal energies. This is Eros calling. This is Eros calling. Terrifying because the self is more powerful and the ego must relinquish its place of centrality. The image of a foghorn suggests that if one has ears to hear, an unconscious collision might be averted. This idea of becoming virgin again was completely foreign to me. In her book, The Moon and the Virgin, Nor Hall explains, to be virginal does not mean to be chaste, but rather to be true to nature and instinct. It took me more than a decade with Jung's insights to understand that the persona I had formed in order to adapt to life had lost contact with the virginal inner places, the hidden parts that sought recognition. Okay, so I was reading from The Unseen Partner by Diane Croft, and The Unseen Partner is based on 3 years of mystical experiences that Diane had back in the 1990s. During this period, she was given 700 poems, and this book has gathered the most poignant for her. And so that's that. I will look over at the YouTube chat from time to time and comment on your chat. And Sepha's goof morning. Yes, it's goofy, all right. Last night I was out late with some dear friends from 20 and 30 years back who were forming a major corporation with me. And we already created one public company, but we're going to do another one. And so we were able to get together for the first time in a year because of the pandemic and have dinner out together. That was very nice. Okay, the next reading, and set that aside. The next reading is from Jerry Wright's book, Mystical Path Less Traveled, a Jungian Psychological Perspective. And this is the Logos speaking. So Dr. Wright is trying to understand in a left brain kind of way his whole career, because he's both a Jungian analyst and a Presbyterian minister. Here's what he says. We create theological words, names, and doctrines, and assume we know that which has been named. Yet what we know is only the name we have attached to the mystery that has come calling. This name is part of the foreground, while the background remains obscure, unknown, and ultimately unknowable. What we do know all too well, however, are our human capacities for great good and great evil. We know this from our motivations and behavior. They are experiential facts verified by our human history and our personal history up to the present moment. Theologically, we may speculate as to the origins of those capacities in the far-off background, yet their operations in and through the human psyche need our greater attention. Okay, so this is the customary answer in Jungian psychology, which is that you need to reflect on what happens to you when you have a mystical experience. You need to reflect on it. Decided to leave the virtual background off today because that way I can show you the book. So I'm going to go back to Diane Croft's book now, The Unseen Partner, page 18. And the topic for this 2-page segment is entitled The Holy Ghost. Who is this three of thee and me? A Holy Ghost in daylight, calling, stirring in my bed this night, cauldron for my troubled soul, reminding me again and again of the living power it holds over my dominion. And the image that she's chosen is called Friendship from 1907. And it was painted by Mycologis Konstantinas Karolionis from Lithuania. And then the quote, the wisdom quote from the Tao Te Ching. The one engenders the two engenders the three, and the three engenders all things, from the Tao Te Ching. Now, if you've been involved with Jungian psychology for some time, you'll know that this also sounds like the theorem of Maria by Maria Prophetessa, which was written in the 3rd century. I think I probably can recite her version. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 3, 3 becomes 4, which becomes the 1 again. All right, so here's what Diane's commentary is. Holy Ghost. Since I was baptized Lutheran, the image of the Holy Ghost was not foreign to me, though I understood nothing of its meaning. Since I now believe this collection is about the relationship between my conscious ego and the larger archetypal self, then I can only say that the relationship involves a third. Who is this three of thee and me? In Mythology of the Soul, Baines writes, the number 3 is specifically associated with the creative. Excuse me. Try to cut that out. Let me. Sorry. Good morning and welcome to springtime. I apologize for that. I will begin this reading again. Just a moment while. There, at least I didn't do that in your ears. Okay. I'm going to begin Diane's commentary on the Holy Ghost again. Holy Ghost. Since I was baptized Lutheran, the image of the Holy Ghost was not foreign to me, though I understood nothing of its meaning. Since I now believe this collection is about the relationship between my conscious ego and my larger archetypal self, then I can only say that that relationship involves a third. Who is this three of thee and me? In Mythology of the Soul, Baines writes, the number 3 is specifically associated with the creative process. Every function of energy in nature has indeed the form of a pair of opposites, united by a third factor, their product. Jung identified the third as one of the stages of individuation. The advance to the third stage means something like the recognition of the unconscious, if not actual subordination to it. So, as I understand it, stage one equals the original state of wholeness, the preconscious totality. Stage two represents separation and the emergence of opposites, ego consciousness. And stage three would be the union of the opposites through the agency of the Holy Ghost, now contained within the human vessel. And so, as I think about this, and I've thought about this basic idea through the theorem of Maria for many years, I think of an individual, regardless of gender, who is alone, and suddenly they meet a person of the opposite gender, and then they become two, and so they become a couple, and then that couple magically produces a third thing, which is a child, and that child is the synthesis of one and the other. And this is the way life evolves, actually. So it's thesis, you individually, antithesis, your opposite, which we call a couple, and then synthesis. So it's thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So the synthesis would be the child, which is the combination of the man and the woman, and that is the child. And then that also becomes the fourth thing, which is the family. And so that becomes one again. So now you have a family, you have a nuclear family of two parents and a child, and that is the thesis. And then magically you have a second child, and that second child is now the antithesis. So it's the family and second child, and that synthesizes into the family again. So the second child is kind of a interloper, and the first child is often jealous about the second child, and you have to be very careful that they don't do harm to the first child. If you have a 2-year-old, they might get feisty at the baby, and so you have to be sure. And so, but eventually the baby is welcomed into the family, and then the family becomes one again, and now the opportunity for yet another iteration. But each one of these iterations in consciousness is how we evolve our consciousness throughout life. And so, we are ourselves, and then we're presented with something that is not us, whatever it is, whether it's a baseball bat or a doll or whatever, and that's the antithesis. And then the synthesis would be you have learned what the baseball bat is for, or what the doll is for, and then you are one with it. You become one with it, and then if you do something with it, you learn about a game or about playing house. That might be the antithesis again, and that's what to do with it, and so on. And so our whole life is that kind of evolution of thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. And when the synthesis comes, that's also the one again. So it's you with the synthesized antithesis, if you will. Okay, so that's what Diane Croft is talking about from the Eros side. Now I'm going back to Jerry Wright, to A Mystical Path Less Traveled, and I'm not trying to give you direct equivalencies between these two books. That would be too hard, and although probably possible. In other words, I would probably be able to find segments of Jerry's book which matched up with the pages of Diane's book, but I have not done that analysis. So I'm just going back and forth between the two books to show you sort of the distinction between Eros and Logos, and to bring new ideas into your head. So Jerry's next reading. Religions have spent far too much time, energy, and ink trying to understand the supposed remote, metaphysical, supernatural interventionist. Being and precious few resources seeking to understand the human psyche and imagination that created the categories of deities, devils, and religions in the first place. Supernatural theism seduced us away from our own nature by our trying to understand the nature of external, metaphysical, interventionist gods. In the last 100 years, Jung's analytical psychology can be seen as a necessary compensation for that seduction. We now know that the images of deities and devils serve as mirrors of our unknown selves that desire to be brought to consciousness, or, to employ traditional religious language, images that desire to be incarnated. Depth psychology, or to employ traditional religious language, images that desire to be incarnated. Depth psychology provides a pathway to come home to ourselves, to our home in the natural world, rather than a supposed supernatural one. Now, as I read that, that brings to mind quite a few things. One is that God, in the theistic sense, is not some puppeteer up there. God is in here and in here. And so we need to become conscious of that fact and work with it, because that God often controls our life. We may think we control our ego life, but in fact we don't. And if you become familiar with the God image, as Jung called it, or the self, then you can often sort of expect what the result will be, and you can be conscious of what your God image, yourself, wants you to do. And that requires paying attention. It requires reflection, which is the sort of the school solution in Jungian psychology. Okay. Brian, I'm going to deny your comment here. I'm sorry. You say that this stuff is not you. Well, it's not you. Goodbye. All right. All right. So that was the second reading from Jerry Wright. Now I'm going back to The Unseen Partner by Diane Croft, back to the Eros side. And so the next stage is This Thing I Love, is what the title of this 2 pages is. And here's the poem. I heard you calling, it was the wind. I heard you singing, it was the river. I heard your footsteps, it was my heart. Okay, so here's the image that Diana selected for it, This Thing That I Love. And the title of the image is Chris Dow 2007 American. So it's an American painting. And the quote from Edward Edinger's Ego and Archetype. Symbols transmit to the ego, either consciously or unconsciously, life energy which supports, guides, and motivates the individual. And now Diane's commentary, This Thing I Love. The eruption of poetry and its inherent images carried me through this ordeal, not only carried, but guided me. I was unaware of this until I read of the importance of symbols during Jung's own encounter. To the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images, that is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed and reassured. Had I left those images hidden in the emotions, I might have been torn to pieces by them. And that's a quote from Dr. Jung. Find the notes quickly. I'll tell you what the footnote is here. I'm looking at the wrong thing. Sorry. Footnote is it's not the Jungian thing I was expecting, so I must be looking at the wrong place. Anyway, that was a quote from Jung. I'm going to read Jung's quote once again, so that it's clear that it's from Jung. To the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images, that is to say, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed and reassured. Had I left those images hidden in the emotions, I might have been torn to pieces by them. In this poem, which arrived early on, in this poem that arrived early on, the voice that calls me is reassuring. Come hither unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Matthew 11:28. This is the promise that pulled me in, even though the body of archetypal images that resides in the collective unconscious is shared by all of humanity. The particular images that break through are specific to the individual. So for me, the unconscious was attempting to balance my one-sided intuitive personality with a largely neglected sensation function side, the ability to perceive things as they are through the 5 senses. My dominant thinking function needed to learn to value the importance of feelings, especially my own. Certain lost aspects of the self craved conscious recognition at this stage of my life. Okay, so this book that Diane Croft has written is a collection of 700 Well, it's based on a collection of 700 poems that came to Diane in a numinous way, unbidden. They wrote themselves onto her computer screen, is how she describes it. And so from those, she's selected these, or this book worth of poems, which actually describe the individuation process. So I'll just read her poem once again. This thing I love. I heard you calling, it was the wind. I heard you singing, it was the river. I heard your footsteps, it was my heart. Okay, so that's the poem that was given to Diane by this self, this collective unconscious part of her psyche. And it was based on that she spoke. Now, also, what Diane is referring to about these opposites in the psyche refers to the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So Diane, which is typical, especially of women, is a very intuitive person. And so as an intuitive, she doesn't get the details, all the factual details that are around her. She just knows. And I know this because I happen to be in the 99th percentile of intuitive. So the way I describe this difference is intuitive, a sensing person, you can show them 1,000 trees and they won't believe there's a forest. But an intuitive person, you can show them 3 trees and they'll assume it's a forest. And that's just a difference of personality type. But you have to be familiar with both sides of your psyche because they're opposites and they're both in you. And so my problem in life has always been that I'm way out on this right end of the scale. And because of that, I have a blinder between me and the details. And so when I say something and I sort of can't get through to what others don't understand, because I get it. And as I say, I grok it. Grok is, look that up, it's GROK. And that's a term that was coined by Robert Heinlein in the book Stranger in a Strange Land. And basically the whole novel is a definition of the term grok. So you need to do that to appreciate what it is I'm talking about when I use that term. But I grok it immediately. And so, and Diane is also talking about the fact that she's a thinking person, which is what I am. And so we're very logical in the way we think through things. And we can't, it's hard to feel things. But more feeling people, feel things very deeply and very painfully often. You can often find them crying at the sight of a child or something, and whatever it is. And so it's hard for people who are thinking people to appreciate the feeling side. But you often see it with me coming through when I begin to get tearier. I start weeping. That's a sign that it's the feeling side that's touching me. And these days, the last few years, as I've been doing these videos, I intentionally let that flow so that you can see that side of me coming through. Otherwise, I'm very typically a thinking guy. And I started my life mainly in the logos by becoming a U.S. Marine and then a lawyer and then an MBA and then teaching finance. And so all those things were very logos oriented. But then I had an extremely eros oriented experience where my anima, as we call it in Jungian psychology, my anima possessed me for 8 months and forced me to write her story, which is a novel, and you can find that novel, which I wrote under a pen name. It's entitled Mako Memoirs of a Woman. So I literally wrote the biography of my anima, and so I was writing it from the feminine side. Definitely, I'll put it in the chat here. It's by David Garrettson, which is my pen name. There it is. You can find that on YouTube. You can find, or I'm sorry, on Amazon if you like. It's only in Kindle form, but just be warned that it contains what would be euphemistically called erotica, and it gets quite intense in parts. So just beware and don't read it if that will offend you. Okay, so now I'm going to go back. Now I'm going to go back to Jerry Wright's book, A Mystical Path Less Traveled. Jerry comes from the Logos side, so from his journal. All last night I wrestled, Jacob-like, with the notion of external deities and devils as the cause of our shallow religion, particularly Western Christianity. The root values of honesty, kindness, civility, justice, and democracy are being traded away for the promise of greatness and given sanction by conservative Christians. We are witnessing the dismantling of human and humane values under the leadership of a cult figure. This dismantling is then given validation with God Bless America and In God We Trust. Really? Really? We have killed God with our shallow God talk. Our culture may be too far gone to nurture soul, wed as it is to capitalism, consumerism, and materialism. And while our culture wastes away too much, too many theologians continued to argue over biblical interpretations, ancient doctrines, and creeds. All of this leaves our religious institutions, in the words of the poet Rilke, like places where God is imprisoned and lamented like a trapped and wounded animal. Okay. I'm going to read that one again. But here, what Jerry is doing, the cult figure he's referring to is, of course, our former president. And Jerry, in the fullness of time, he served decades as a Presbyterian minister. And so he can now look back on that career, as he says, from the back porch of the church and see how his former colleagues misuse religion to guide us into things that we shouldn't be doing. So let me read that again because it's an important passage and it's central to what Dr. Wright is talking about. All last night I wrestled, Jacob-like, with the notion of external deities and devils as the cause of our shallow religion, particularly Western Christianity. The root values of honesty, kindness, civility, justice, and democracy are being traded away for the promise of greatness and given sanction by conservative Christians. We are witnessing the dismantling of human and humane values under the leadership of a cult figure. This dismantling is then given validation with "In God, God Bless America" and "In God We Trust." Really? We have killed God with our shallow God talk. Our culture may be too far gone to nurture soul, wed as it is to capitalism, consumerism, and materialism. And while our culture wastes away, too many theologians continue to argue over biblical interpretations, ancient doctrines, and creeds. All of this leads our religious institutions, in the words of the poet Rilke, like places where God is imprisoned and lamented like a trapped and wounded animal, unquote. Okay, so the point is that the religious instinct comes from the numinous. And so I'm giving you examples of numinous things that came to Diane Croft as we're reading here. And so if you hear theologians arguing about what St. Augustine had in mind, or whether Jacob actually was attacked by an angel, those are sterile arguments because they get away from the true religious instinct which Dr. Jung found. So let me see. Danny Van Heck is sending me a link about how Christianity has caused serious damage. Well, it certainly has. And Kushbu is here. Good evening, Kushbu. It's quite late where you are, so thank you for being here. So now I'm going to go back to the Eros side, and I'm reading from The Unseen Partner by Diane Croft, Love and Longing in the Unconscious. And this segment is called Tracks. These lines on my face mark the time before you came, before you looked into my face and changed it. These lines mark the time I spent in idle worship of things that matter less than your walk. And so Diane has chosen this image, Tracks, and it's entitled Bird Tracks in Sand, 2007, photo by Tomcat X, Germany. And so she's referring to her crinkly lines, of which I have many, but they come from a time before God came to her. And this quote from Edward Edinger, Ego and Archetype. If the self is to be recognized as the supreme value, attachments to lesser values must be destroyed. And then Diane's commentary. Tracks. This poem reminds me of an insightful quote from Abraham Lincoln. Quote, "Every man is responsible for his face after the age of 40, unquote. And then just this morning, I read a quote from the New York Times by Uruguayan novelist Juan Carlos Onetti. Quote, "All unextraordinary men are already coming apart once they've turned 40, unquote. My eye missed the in the first reading, and I had to read it again to catch the meaning. What we euphemistically call midlife crisis has a purpose. The face we show the world during our developmental years, striving, defending, building, must be softened in the later years with its complement, allowing, accepting, being. Of course, it works in reverse just as well. Jung referred to this as the individuation process. What youth found and must find outside, the man of life's afternoon must find within himself. Authentic aspects of the self, which were sacrificed to appease the collective ideal, must be recovered to reveal what the Buddhists call, quote, the face behind the face, or the face before you were born, unquote. And so here we're talking about the persona, and in youth, we're taught to build up a persona. So, for example, I had to learn to be a U.S. Marine and present a persona of being a Marine, and I did that for 23 years, quite actively. But then you realize that that is a persona. That's not who you are. That's who the collective thinks a Marine is. And so when I put on my uniform, I become like that persona, certainly. And even today, I have a dress uniform, which I sometimes wear to go to an honor salute for a dying veteran. And that's a quite meaningful ceremony to me. And it's one of the reasons why in normal times, when we're not, when we're able to go out, then I'm going to wear my uniform, and I wear my hair short. During our quarantine, I wasn't able to get a proper haircut, but I also wasn't able to do any honor salutes. And so, you know, men and women who are dying and have served the United States, I feel very strongly about saluting their service even as they're dying. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to a mystical path less traveled, a Jungian psychological perspective. We are the deities and devils long seen, necessarily so in projected images and forms. Over the slow slog of human consciousness, it was necessary to see aspects of ourselves in projected forms before we could recognize them as parts of our hidden or unconscious selves. That recognition and ownership has barely begun. We seem to prefer to keep our deities and devils at a distance, up there, out there. It seems easier and safer that way. Worshiping an external God continues to be preferred over incarnation. So what Dr. Wright is saying here is that we named all our gods. We human beings named them, regardless of where we live or what religion we followed. Human beings have named them, and they're really parts of us. But when we were less sophisticated beings, they seemed too powerful, too strong for us. And so our shadow side, the devil side, if you will, seemed like a very powerful creature. And as some of you know, I've even had a vision of Mephistopheles plopping down in the seat next to me when I was driving 65 miles an hour. And so these can be very powerful forces that come up. And fortunately, when that happened, I knew that it was a vision from my unconscious, And so it didn't scare me quite as much, but I can imagine if I was living 500 years ago and some fire and brimstone preacher had described the devil, um, and then I had a vision of him like the way the preacher described him, that would be quite frightening. And I would see it as outside of myself, but it's actually in us. And so we have to be cognizant of that and take those projections back and understand that these powers are within us for both good and evil. I was watching um, Lawrence of Arabia the last 2 days for a variety of reasons. And that book, movie, and the book is called The Seven Pillars of Wisdom. And that movie is an excellent experiential way of showing how evil can emerge from a human being, especially if you see the director's cut of Lawrence of Arabia, which is 3.5 hours long, but it's also extremely powerful when you see all the scenes that they filmed. And some of them were cut out in the theater version of the movie. And so it lost a little bit of its punch, not all of it, but it lost a little bit of its punch, and it failed in the theater version to really show this recognition of the evil side of a human being. And but the director's cut definitely shows that, where the evil side came through. And Lawrence, in T.E. Lawrence, the author and the person about whom that movie was made, in his book, Seven Pillars of Wisdom, actually mentions evil in the very first sentence of the book. So he knew well enough. Let's see what else we've got going here. Okay, so I'm going back to Diane Croft's book now, The Unseen Partner, Love and Longing in the Unconscious by Diane Croft. And I'm reading from her poem that was given to her through a numinous experience. And the title of this section is called Leaving Home. We leave home that we might know it, warm meadow naps, under sun-washed skies, allowing a dream to float by, thinking we might escape reality, behold what was lost long ago, wishing we could remember who walked softly away. And the image that she selected is this one. So I'll read the caption. It's Sunset, Newburyport Meadow, 1863, by Martin Johnson Heed, 1819 to 1904, American Oil on Board, St. Louis Art Museum purchase. Okay, so here's the quote. The transient, evanescent side of a man must pass away in order that something or someone lasting may reign supreme in him. And that's by C. Rice from a book called The Persian Sufis. I'll read it again. The transient, evanescent side of a man must pass away in order that something or someone lasting may reign supreme in him. That Diane's quote. Leaving home Countless myths and folk tales begin with a hero leaving home to embark upon a quest. Psychologically, this signifies a necessary departure from the familiar. Each new step in the evolution of consciousness requires a separation from the collective conscious attitude. One must strike out on one's own to find one's own truth. There is a poem, not included in this collection, that begins, "Everything tells me this is a solo flight, awake before the sun," and ended ambiguously, knowing even hope offers temporary refuge, trying to keep myself airborne. A journey to the center of the psyche could end in a life-threatening crash or the discovery of exotic territories. The stakes are high. Part of the disillusionment for me with the modern idea of enlightenment is its one-sided notion of don't worry, be happy. There is plenty to worry about. Dragons, witches, trolls, giants, snakes, spells, poisons, vampires, wild beasts, and so on. We need a hero's heart to do battle with the autonomous forces of the unconscious. Nor can we stay home. We must be fully engaged in the world in order to explore, discover, and ultimately reclaim what was lost long ago. I just want to point out that we human beings are the only creatures that have this problem because an oak tree or a dog or a cat just evolve through their lifetime, and they start as a seed, whether it's a human being or I mean, whether it's a dog or a tree, and then they evolve through their life and become what they become. But human beings often get sidetracked and off on very complicated, not very useful paths. And so, I could say, all right, if you're going to be a lawyer, go to law school for 3 years, or you could just forget it and live your life and not go down that path. And my experience with being a lawyer, and I have been one for over 40 years now, 45 years, is that it was great going to law school. I really enjoyed the study and learning all the rules, which men often do. We're guided by the logos primarily. And so when somebody gives you a lot of rules and you can learn them and grok them, then that's a great experience. But the problem is I detested the practice of law, the actual practice of law. And the reason is that I was always dealing with other people's hardships, and I hadn't really grokked that when I was in law school or in the years before I was a lawyer. And I didn't particularly enjoy dealing with other people's problems or writing contracts for people who were making companies, for example. I wanted to be making the company. I didn't want to be making it possible for someone else to have a company. And that's what I was doing. And so after 5 years of practicing law actively, I decided to have only one client, and that client was me. So for the last 40 years, my one and only client has been me, and to a certain degree to my wife. I've been her lawyer also, but otherwise I haven't been anybody's lawyer. And so let's see, where are we? So I'm going to go back to a mystical path less traveled. Next segment. We are the deities and devils seen in projected images and forms over the centuries, yet we have erroneously exported these unconscious aspects, potentials of ourselves, to theistic and monotheistic religions as external, supernatural, interventionist beings. It is a sad irony that the salvific term substantiary atonement. Okay, it's a sad irony that the salvific term substitutionary atonement, so prized by evangelical Christianity, may actually be the core issue for the destruction of our species and environment. That is, religions that substitute outer solutions to inner issues may be seductive salves for our human predicaments, yet they cannot save us from ourselves. And so that's a fairly uncommon word, salvific. Remember that the word atonement actually breaks up to at-one-ment. And so if we give ourselves a salve, or we just cover over our pain, it's like using Bengay on your shoulder or leg pain from too much exercise. That may make us feel good for a period of time, but if we keep doing that, then we can actually destroy ourselves. And this is Jerry's position here. And so we have to remember that we are the deities, we are the devils, and we've projected them outside ourselves for centuries. But the reality is that they're not outside ourselves, they're in us. We are it. So I'm going to read this section again. I'll try to do it more fluently this time. We are the deities and devils seen in projected images and forms over the centuries, yet we have erroneously exported these unconscious aspects, potentials to ourselves, or of ourselves, to theistic and monotheistic religions as external, supernatural, interventionist beings. It is a sad irony that the salvific term, substitutionary atonement, so prized by evangelical Christianity, may actually be the core issue for the destruction of our species and environment. That is, religions that substitute outer solutions to inner issues may be seductive salves for our human predicament, yet they cannot save us from ourselves. It's a very powerful idea. I often say that God is not up there, God's in here and in here. But Jerry puts his finger on it quite heavily. Danny says, humanity seems to be egocentric by nature. Yes, and probably we needed that to develop as a species, but now as we've developed and our psyche has developed, we have to look back and say, okay, what does that get us, and how can we change and make ourselves better creatures? And unfortunately, Christianity is still flashbanged or hypnotized, as Dr. Jung said, by events that happened 2,000 years ago. And what we have to do is start looking forward and trying to figure out where the spirit is guiding us, because it is guiding us somewhere. And I'm talking about the collective spirit. And you can clearly see the collective spirit in the events of January 6th in the United States, where a part of it, an evil side decided that it wanted to invade the U.S. Capitol, and in a psychic epidemic, these people who thought that they were patriots and were saving the country, they saw themselves as saving the country, but what they were actually doing was committing assault and battery and literally murder. And so we have to be able to step back from that kind of evil and understand. And so now, as the fullness of time develops, we see that the rest of the collective is rejecting that behavior, and a lot of those men, primarily men, are going to spend time in jail. They'll have a lot of time to think about it. Just a minute, I have a guest here. They're going to have a lot of time to think about it. And so we have to understand that some of our norms, or all of our norms, are good norms. And so anyway, good evening, Yuan. Nice to see you. So I'm pressing on with my reading of The Unseen Partner by Diane Croft, and my reading of The Mystical Path Less Traveled. And this amounts to an eros side and a logos side of looking at the same sorts of issues. And Brad asked me the question, what does that mean, that you're your own lawyer? Well, I've had plenty of legal issues come up in my life. In 1979, after I got my MBA, I went into business and I became a business executive, and have been essentially that in my daily life that brings income into the family. I've been a business executive, and in that role, I often run into legal issues of all kinds, and so I can see my way through the legal issues because I am a lawyer, and that's what I mean by that. And I've had some troubles too, because in 2008, the way we've allowed our financial system to develop, the investment bankers on Wall Street were able to inflate the currency. They got away with it because it wasn't showing in the statistics of inflation. It was showing in the number of fraudulent loans that were being made by Wall Street. And they were literally taking the same mortgage as a security multiple times, and then putting that into securities where they were hidden. So let's say if a community wanted to put money into a bond to have an income for let's say the retirement fund of a community, the policeman's fireman's fund or something like that, they would invest in these mortgage-backed securities. The problem was that there weren't really mortgages behind those securities, and that's what caused the crash of 2008. Well, that destroyed a lot of us. It allowed Wall Street to harvest our life savings. They harvested mine. And the reason I say that is because the Wall Street investment bankers managed to get themselves paid double on all defaulted mortgages. Once by the TARP, the so-called TARP, that President George W. Bush and Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson got the Congress to pass, the panicked Congress. They simply said, we have to throw $450 billion into the economy. And what they were doing was making sure that all the investment banks didn't lose any money. So they literally, among other things, on one night, President Bush called together 9 bankers and on one sheet of paper each, gave each one of them $25 billion to keep their banks solvent. And so that was 225 billion right there. Now, I strongly believe, based on a 10-year lawsuit that I conducted for myself, that they never paid that back. And so the banks were safe. They didn't lose any money right away. That happened in 2008. But then they proceeded to just allow the destruction of the economy to go on. And the result of that was 10 million families lost their homes. And I was one of them. But, it wasn't because I was a deadbeat per se. It was because the economy had stopped, basically. And so though I had no income, I had to pay my mortgage every month. And finally, about 2 years later, I ran out of money and I ran out of my savings because the banks were still collecting this money, even though they'd been made whole. And so finally, the bank tried to foreclose on my home, but as an attorney, I was able to fight that for 10 years. And so I ran a lawsuit that went to the Court of Appeals of Maryland 5 times and the U.S. Supreme Court once. And never in that time did I get to present my case to a jury of my peers. The judges simply shut down and wouldn't allow me to have a trial even. And so in the course of that, which involved filing 4,000 pages of documents over a 10-year period, I learned how things can go wrong. So that was me being my own lawyer. But the good news about that was I was able to stay in my home for 10 years, even though I wasn't paying during that period. But who's right, who's wrong? I don't say that I was necessarily right. I was definitely right on the law, but if the courts actually allowed me to be right, then that could have caused much more problem, which maybe they were right, maybe they weren't. I have my questions. If I had been able to present my case to a jury of my peers, I probably would have had a good chance of winning my case. But would that have caused other problems in the financial industry? Maybe, and maybe it was worth it to keep me out. So Danny says, there seems to be a problem with lack of intelligence. So maybe genetic manipulation could help to upgrade human intelligence. Well, yes, perhaps it could, but perhaps it could also be destructive. So I think, I think the odds are 50-50 that that we might get Frankenstein instead of a more brilliant human being. But anyway, that cat seems to be out of the bag. So, we're going to find out what the result is, and probably it will be quite mixed. So the big cat says the very wealthy have been harvesting the middle class for the past 40 years. Precisely, that's what they've been doing, and they can convince many people in the middle class that it's the fault of the Democrats, or it's the fault of some religious organization. And really, what they're doing is stealing our money. That's what they have done. But people think it's more important to worry about these social issues, like whether, who sleeps together and that sort of thing. So they keep this half of our society thinking that those issues are more important than their financial well-being. And so the result is that, um, a lot of the very poorest people in the country support the falsehoods of the wealthiest by supporting the Republican Party. And unfortunately, plenty of people have observed this. I'm not the first one, but that's the way they get away with it. And Brad says, do you feel we are entering a new icon? The big cat asks, and I ask, what is an icon? Dictation problem, Eon, Aquarius. Yes. Do I think that we are entering a new age? Yes, we are. We definitely are. And so the age of Pisces was the age of putting the devil outside of us and saying that we're all good. But that all came crashing down, not because of Nietzsche, but Nietzsche was the first to say what a lot of people were thinking. A lot of, especially Western men, in terms of the logos, were saying, we can see back to the Big Bang, and we can see down to the Higgs boson, and there's no God there, physical, in the physical world. And so therefore, why believe in these religions? And so once the fundamental belief of religions fell apart, then people thought that they could do anything they want to do. And the result was that we had 280 million people killed in the 20th century due to war. That wasn't good. and so now we have to come to a new perspective and a new way of thinking about ourselves and the world. And that change it's bigger than an earthquake, it's bigger than a tsunami, and it's bigger than a volcanic eruption. It is just changing us hugely. And part of that is it's changing the collective unconscious hugely, because many people in the world didn't have access to information. As I've said many times, 400 years ago, the average person got as much information in a lifetime as we currently get in the Sunday New York Times. And so suddenly in 1995, when we opened up the World Wide Web to everyone, it means that anybody anywhere in the world can have access to all the world's information, essentially, except for company secrets and country secrets, but all the information about the development of humanity from the beginning to now is available to everyone on the internet. And that's only 25 years since that happened. But the result of it is cataclysmic. In my case, I actually got connected in 1983. And by 1985, I met my wife, my current wife, online. And that connection caused my first marriage to break up. And, I had an interchange with my wife over a 4-month period. And in 4 months, I knew her better than I knew my own wife. And then I left and came to Washington area. And we've been together ever since. And that's now 35 years. But it also meant that, and that happened in August of 1985. So 10 years before the commercial internet got going, but it's symptomatic of the changes that are coming when we get more information from outside. And so the result is that people see other opportunities or other possibilities, and they just boom, say, boy, I want that, I don't want this. And so, we see that coming very strongly in the Muslim world, where women were held back very severely and covered up and so on. And now women in Muslim countries can see the way women in the rest of the world live, and they say, I want to live that way. I don't want to live the way my mother and grandmother were forced to live in our society. And so it's causing cataclysmic changes in societies all over the world, and it will continue to do so. I currently have on the Zoom call a friend who is from a country that doesn't allow its citizens to view YouTube. And so the only way she can get this information is by watching live on Zoom. And, those kind of restrictions are inevitably going to fall because they can't, they're unsustainable. If everybody in the world has access to information except your country, you're definitely going to fall behind. That's the essence of that. So yes, we are entering a new age, and that's customarily called Aquarius because of astrology. There's nothing magical about that. There's no wooey woo in that. There's not, astrologers didn't look up at the sky and all of a sudden see that, oh geez, in the year 2000 or the year 1995, all of a sudden everybody will have all the information in the world. That was not predicted, of course not. But the reality is that these changes are entirely changing the way human beings are across the world. And so it doesn't matter what we call it. And this is Dr. Wright's point that, we named it. We human beings named it the Aquarian age, but, there's nothing outside us that did. And so Big Cat says, God is dead and we killed him. Well, yes, we didn't kill actual God. Okay, that's the point. Okay. We killed the false story that we were told by our religious leaders for the last 2,000 years. That was killed. And so, we have theologians that are arguing about the meaning of biblical passages, but they're arguing about the meaning of, you know, a few sentences of Gone with the Wind, for example. It might as well be that, because in that sense it is a novel too, because the religions basically were founded on dreams and visions and numinous experiences, such as Diane Croft is describing in her Unseen Partner book. She's describing numinous experiences that she was having, especially over a 3-year period, which emerged in the form of 700 poems. And that was a very powerful experience for her. And so, if it was 2,000 years ago, she could probably form a religion based on those things. But what she's describing is just basic human nature, and what Dr. Jung observed and taught us about. And so the way I say it is, Nietzsche observed that God is dead and we have killed him, but Dr. Jung came along in the next generation and found the living God where he lives and how he goes about doing the work of the Godhead. And you can see my video on this YouTube channel called Finding the Living God. And once you find the living God, which is the living God that's connected into your psyche, no matter who you are, no matter what you've learned in your youth, once you find that God that's within you, then you'll never go back. And it's a religion around that God that we need to develop. And so Dr. Jung observed to Max Zoller that we're all building on a new kind of temple, a new way of perceiving ourselves. And so the instincts that brought forth all the religions, not only the Abrahamic religions, those instincts are still very much alive in us, and they're alive in all human beings. And so we need to get more thoughtful about that. And so anyway, so we haven't killed God, we've just killed a false narrative about God. That's what we've done. So Mistel says, isn't some of this type belief in the Celestine prophecy? I could be wrong. Mistel, I don't remember. I know that the Celestine prophecy is a very powerful book. I read it 30 years ago, so I can't really talk about the details of that book any longer, but I remember being quite moved when I read it. So I'm sure you're probably right. And the Big Cat says, yes, the Celestine prophecy is about the emergence of the age of Aquarius. And Mekdi says, prophecy or prophecy. Well, I'm not sure what the dichotomy is, but the point is that what were prophets? Okay, prophets were people who could predict the future based on knowing the past. Basically, that's what a prophet is. It's not, having a 12-year-old girl saying, I prophesy X, Y, Z is going to happen. That wouldn't be possible. But the prophets, and Jesus Christ was certainly one of those, but so was the prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. All of them knew history and knew human nature. And so they could predict how things would come out in the future. And they were right. And so that's why the false narrative survived for 2,000 years, but now it's dying. And, as people listen to what I'm reading here, they're going to see that it's dying. Okay, so I'm going to go back now to Diane Croft, the unseen partner, and I'm going to read a segment called Barely There. So here's the poem. Your face appears as the moon, luminous against a black sky. I look to see if you are full or barely there, or gone this night. And here's the image that she's showing of the moon. And the image is called Moonrise, 1884, by Stanislaw Masłowski of Poland. And the quote, sometimes he makes you learn in the night of contraction what you have not learned in the radiance of the day of expansion. You do not know which of them is nearer to you in benefit. And that quote is from Ibn Ata'Allah, 13th century Sufi poet. So I'll just read it again. Sometimes he makes you learn in the night of contraction what you have not learned in the radiance of the day of expansion. You do not know which of them is nearer to you in benefit. And here's Diane's commentary. Barely There. This poem expresses a growing state of alienation from the source. When the ego gets too inflated, claiming these enormous transpersonal energies as its own, the unconscious psyche brings about an adjustment, which the ego experiences as a rejection. One day you're royalty, the next day you're dirt. This is part of the natural cycle of life, as long as you don't stay suspended in any one phase indefinitely. Kabir, a 15th century Sufi Hindu master, wrote, between the conscious and the unconscious, the mind has put up a swing. All earth creatures, even the supernovas, sway between these two trees, and it never winds down. So, I guess we know someone who's experienced that in spades, and that is our former president, who one day he was royalty and the next day he's dirt. I was seeing an article about his airplane, the one that has his name emblazoned on the side of it, and it's in bad disrepair in some airport up in Long Island and hasn't been used for a very long time. Edinger further explains, in the early phases, representing approximately the first half of life, the cycle is experienced as an alternation between two states of being, namely inflation and alienation. Later, a third stage appears, which is characterized by a conscious dialectic relationship between the ego and self. This state is individuation. And so our erstwhile former president was certainly in a state of inflation his whole life. And he always said, only I can fix it, and that sort of thing, which is the type of thing that a 6-year-old says. And he didn't understand that that was an inflated attitude that couldn't be supported. And so that section was from The Unseen Partner by Diane Croft. So now I'll go back to Jerry Wright's book, Mystical Path Less Traveled, and we'll look at it from a logos point of view. This is a bit of a longer segment here. The theistic view of God has not made our world safer, nor has it brought us closer to the metaphorical reign of God. The last century was arguably the most violent and deadly for our species and for our planetary home. While the world has profited by advances in modern technology, compassion for each other and our environment does not seem to be on the rise. As long as our deities and devils are perceived to be beyond life in a remote metaphysical domain, we will continue to do great harm to each other, to ourselves, and to our fragile nest. We are tasked with bringing our deities and devils home to our human psyche, where they originated, so that we can be responsible for the powers of creativity and destruction that are in our human hearts and hands. Near the end of his long career exploring the human soul in great depths, Jung could still write, quote, "We need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature, because the only real danger that exists is man itself. He is the real danger, and we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied, because we are in the origin of all coming evil." So we really don't understand ourselves, and to the extent that we're still following narratives which support religions that no longer support us, we're in this childlike state, and we have to stop and see what they mean. Okay, that doesn't mean that we throw them out. I don't believe we throw them out, because the point is that we have to keep our traditional religions, and we have to use them as like elementary schools to help us understand ourselves. But then, because they do that and have helped for centuries, millennia, really. But now we know these narratives to not be accurate or be skewed in some way. And so now we have to look at these narratives in a much more sensible way and bring those narratives into modern categories of understanding. It doesn't say that, I'm not saying that they're wrong. First of all, half of the Bible is simply historical descriptions of things that were actually happening in the days that it discusses. And so, that's not incorrect. And from the point of view of the so-called miracles, yes, there are miracles, and sometimes they come to us in the form of dreams and visions. But the major things that occur that are miraculous in the Bible are dreams and visions, and they're described as such. And we now have to understand that those are numinous events that occur to all of us every day. This is what Jerry Wright's perception is, that we're all having numinous experiences occurring every single day. And we have to learn to recognize them so that we understand the gifts that we're given by our own nature, which is far beyond the individual. It's in the collective, as Dr. Jung observed. Now let's see what. So there's a long conversation here, which I have to find the beginning of. McD says history, including the future, maybe. Yes, okay. In talking about prophecy. Then Mistel says, when I think I'm my own case of not trusting anyone, hiding behind a mask or a fake name, it makes me wonder if this has had the same impact on these women hidden in burqa, oppressive by design. Absolutely. And good morning or afternoon, Penelope. Mekdi, this is just the title of my reality right about now. Great subject. Mistel says, yes, I can emphasize with the range of celebrity that one can experience, have found myself in a mini example of such. Wild Child says, love that. Mekdi says, I see the mishandling of all the major religions and industry mindset as well, so far as a step rather than a pure wrongdoing. Time will come where people get core truths soon, is my understanding. I think that's right. I think this change is going to happen much more quickly than Dr. Jung anticipated. He said 600 years, but he didn't know anything about the internet and the potential of the internet. The problem is that it can also destroy us more quickly. So, for example, the internet also gave the ability of these Proud Boys and Oath Keepers to get together and attack the capital of the U.S. And so that's the danger side. And Mistel says, if someone is able to understand a core truth, it should be available to them, don't you think? Of course. And Penelope says, Ingaltion and narcissism is rife. Okay, there's a lot of narcissism around. Yes, throwing out is pointless. It has been tried. We have to make the best of it. Jung kind of did it really good in his own way. May we do that too. Jesus's teachings, Buddha's, Sufis, they're rich. Yes, of course they are. Okay, and all of those ancient teachers, the ones that we follow, had truths and they spoke truths. They aren't necessarily the truths that we think they are, but they're very true. For example, when Jesus goes to I think it's two Marthas, or it's a Mary and a Martha, about the death of Lazarus, his friend, he goes into the house with the two women, and Lazarus rises from the dead. But if you take that literally, then you're going to dump on that narrative. But the truth is that our loved ones don't die from us. For example, I mean, in a living sense. For example, my brother died in 1988 at the age of 39. And both of my parents have died in the early 2000s, and they are still with me as much as they ever were. They're right here in my heart, and they actually haven't changed at all. yes, we mourn the fact that we can't have more of them. But on the other hand, we do have what they brought to us over lifetimes. And so they are still having an impact going forward. I mean, my brother's been dead for 32 years, 33 years almost. And yet I'm talking about him right now and telling you that he's still alive in my heart. And so when you lose a loved one, okay, because they've physically died, just remember what I've told you. It's appropriate to mourn. We have to mourn and regret the fact that we can't have more time physically with those people. But at the same time, in the fullness of time, after a few weeks or days or however long it takes, you realize that they're not gone from you. They're still with you. And that's a beautiful piece of knowledge to have, because it means that you haven't lost them. And, you know, there were times during my parents' lifetime when I didn't speak with them for 6 months or a year when I was deployed or what have you. And during that time, I didn't love them less. They lived in my heart just as much as they ever did during those times. And nothing has changed. They're still there with me in the same way. And so it's like a deployment in a way. And so, yes, their physical body has gone and is no more in that sense. Their ashes have been spread on our family farm, but they're still with me and very much alive. And now they're on this video, and they're going to be alive as long as this video exists, and as long as any of you tell a story about how a dead person still lives, as Lazarus does. I mean, Lazarus is living 2,000 years after his physical death, and we're talking about him today. And so, and we wouldn't have to remember his name at all. I mean, the good that story of Lazarus has done over the centuries is enormous, and it spreads out across the universe. And so there's no doubt that Lazarus is essentially immortal for human beings. But I digress. So let me go back here. Miss Stell says, why do we willingly withhold is my question. I'm not sure what you mean by that question, Miss Stell, so I'll go on. What are you talking about withholding? Please tell me that. Mekdi says, not the layers of shadow projection, though. To do that, people should hold the mirror. I have a good feeling about that particular subject. Yes, okay. So understanding your shadow is looking at yourself wholly and fully, including your evil, and then you'll understand what we're talking about. And so Cool Ranch Doritos says, yeah, there is a spiritual void in society right now. I think that what you do with this channel is a positive thing. I certainly hope so, and thank you so much for that. Penelope, the true self is mask-free and confident in and with one's true person, and whole and emphatic to the needs of other and society. Absolutely correct. And so the changes, as Cool Ranch says, maybe even ahead of its time. So these things are happening ahead of its of their time. And so a lot of what politicians do is make us fearful. And one of the things that you must understand is that if you're individuated, then you have no fear of being yourself. And so I've never agreed with using these handles for protecting my identity on the internet. And so I've always done things in my own name, going back as long as I've done things on the internet. And so you see Danny Van Heck and Mistel and Penelope using their own names. And so that means they're no longer fearful about, let's say, the consequences of what they say and do on the internet. But if you're using a handle, chances are you're afraid of something. And that's something that you probably ought to examine yourself about. What are you afraid of? Because as long as you're afraid to be yourself, you won't be yourself. And so, I urge everyone who is listening to this video, either live or on replay, to consider whether you're using a handle. And if you are, you have some work to do on your individuation, because you need to not be afraid to say what needs to be said in your own name. If there was any teaching in this class that I would give, it is that. Still says, and thank you for the compliments, by the way, but I normally don't acknowledge those on YouTube or read them. And the reason is because a quarter of my ancestry is Pennsylvania Dutch. And so that group of my ancestors don't accept compliments, and they don't agree to wear buttons. Well, I have buttons in on my shirt. So the other 3/4 of me say it's okay to wear buttons, but the Pennsylvania Dutch side says don't get too inflated. And so Mistel says, I've been having a better relationship with my stepsister through channeling than ever in life. Well, that's good. I've been having a better relationship with my own sister, my living sister, by channeling and by learning these things too, to the point where on the 22nd of April, I'm going to drive 400 miles just to take her for her COVID shot and take her home, and then drive home. So I'm going to make a 1,000-mile trip in order to help my sister get her COVID shot. And so that's a kind of forgiveness, and a kind of forgiveness of me as well. And he says, my problem is that my dad suffered a lot before dying. Seeing him suffer was much worse than losing him. I'm sure that that's true. And in the throes of death, it's often difficult to see a loved one struggle with that. And, in the end, we all die. And so there's nothing to fear about death. And so the good news is that in most modern countries, we have control of pain. And so most people don't die a painful death if the medical establishment can make that possible for you. And you should look into hospice care and those sorts of things. I can't say in your country, Danny, because I don't know enough about your medical system there, but there is help around from the medical community everywhere, even in countries that aren't fully developed yet. Let's see. And Matthew says, I believe it is not only sweet, but wise to let them live with you with this kind of understanding. Relationships exceed the boundaries of time and semantics. With you on this. Okay, great. Michelle says, we are restricted by circumstance that her death has transcended. Yes, that's great, because that's what you have to do. What I've learned is she is clever and nosy. It has offered me a release from my willful ignorance of things that I've needed to grow me. That's also very true. And, I used to be very critical of my two grandfathers. And then I started to look back and think about the lives they had to lead. And I've become more compassionate toward my grandfathers as I grow older. Estelle, we were restricted by circumstance that her death has transcended. What I've learned, okay, that read that already. Cool says, oh, well, I can tell you my name if you want to know. I'm afraid of people using information to hack my identity or something. Well, okay, that's a reasonable concern, I suppose. But in my experience, who would want to know? Who would want to be me? So yes, you can have your bank account stolen or something like that, but we definitely have preventive measures against that sort of thing now. And honestly, I don't want to know your identity. I don't care. You can be whoever you want to be, but I'm just saying that if you're hiding behind a persona, that means you're afraid of something, and you should consider that. Danny, Holland, our neighbors. I'm Belgian. We're a very small nation, but got a third place in the previous World Championship soccer. We won against Brazil. That was something special. Yes, indeed. And I don't know much about Belgium's soccer team, football team, but I do know something about the Dutch team. And in 1657, the Dutch traded Manhattan and New York, New Amsterdam, for Suriname. Now, that might seem an odd trade to you now, but the reason is that Suriname was filled with spices, and the big deal in those days was spices, and the Dutch were very actively trading spices around the world, whereas Manhattan was just a cold piece of granite and in a very cold place as opposed to Suriname. So the Dutch won the Second Anglo-Dutch War, and the spoils of that war for them was to take on Suriname. Now, Suriname, a fairly large proportion of the Dutch population is actually descended from the people of Suriname. And I know that even recently, about half of the Dutch soccer team was from Suriname. So, and they're quite capable soccer team too. And so, I suspect that may have spilled over a little bit into Belgium, but I just tell you that as an interesting aside. Cool says identity theft may be I'm being paranoid, but it's not you guys I'm afraid of. Yeah, okay, well, fair enough. But you better make sure you have a Norton security on your PC or something like that. And Big Cat says it's a reasonable concern. I agree, it's a reasonable concern. But by the same token, who would care about me? There's 8 billion people on the planet, and I protect obviously my bank account in certain aspects, but I haven't had any particular problem by making my email address public. And so Cool says, I try to choose my words wisely, anonymous or not. Very wise. Okay, now let's go back, and I'm going to go back to the unseen partner. And this is a page called Thread, and I'll read the poem first. Slender is the road, a thread unraveled by a tiny pull so easily undone. When what was woven had been so tightly bound, a pattern emerging from each strand, caught on a rough edge, my undoing. And so the image that she's shown is a piece of lace here. It says the credit for it is traditional freehand lace, origin unknown, photo by Tamara Duval, 2003. And so the topic here is thread. And the quote is, our golden thread is always leading us beyond our preconceptions into a state of unconditional freedom. And that's from Llewellyn von Lee, The Signs of God. And then I'll read Diane's commentary here. Thread. What felt at the time like a coming apart at the seams was actually a call to change old patterns that had kept me locked in an unbalanced life. As Llewellyn von Lee, a Sufi mystic, describes it, quote, because the destiny of the soul is so different from the agenda of our ego self, even our spiritual ego self, this thread will be found where we least expect it. Jung believed that there were deep structures, patterns in the psyche, both personal and collective. The ancient world archetype means the original pattern from which copies are made. Personal patterns, which constellate in childhood based on our life experiences, can be made conscious and changed. If successful, life becomes more manageable. But living a sensible life isn't the same as living a meaningful life. We must each find our own unique pattern of individuality, which Jung believed to be a dynamic process guided by the self. Collective archetypal patterns in the psyche, when they erupt into consciousness, seek to mitigate an imbalance specific to the individual. The unconscious knows more than consciousness does, so to speak. And it serves as a counterbalance to the ego, which strives to preserve the status quo of the personality. For me, a lifetime of striving for perfection, so tightly bound, needed to be balanced with its complement, i.e., the ideal of completion. The charm of freehand lace lies in its imperfections, its unique pattern. Okay, well, I like this idea of the golden thread. I'm going to read that quote one more time. Our golden thread is always leading us beyond our preconceptions into a state of unconditional freedom. And so I'll tell you a story of my own life, because I do believe in golden threads, and golden threads that are in the unconscious, and they're in the collective. And the way I've seen it is in international business. Now, as a lawyer, I believe in contracts and always have believed in contracts. But a contract is actually between persons. It's not a piece of paper. And T.E. Lawrence commented in the 7 Pillars of Wisdom that the Arabs believe in persons, not in institutions. And the point is that if you work internationally, if you have a contract with someone on an international scale, it's the relationship between the people that counts, not a written document. And I had this experience early in my business career. I went to Taiwan with a Australian colleague who was in charge of our Singapore office. I was in charge of our Tokyo office, and we had a agent, a representative in Taiwan, and my colleague Frank Shi, or I'm sorry, my colleague Tom Curry had been supervising the Taiwan business for many years, 10 years or so. And so one fine day, our general counsel back in the U.S. decided to have all agents around the world sign a big, complicated boilerplate contract. It was about this thick, and he wanted Tom and all other people that were dealing with our agents to get our agents to sign this contract so that our relationship with these agents would be the same. And so Tom had this thing printed out and had brought it with him to Taiwan, and I was there, and we were having this conversation with our agent, and Tom said, well, I hate to do this, but I have to give you this document and ask you to sign it. And so our agent said, oh, give me that. He takes it, he turns to the back and he signs it, gives it back, and he says, you know, this doesn't mean anything. And that was a very valuable lesson, because in international law, it's you might be able to sue someone somewhere, but the chances of you winning in a country not your own are slim, if not nil. And so the contract is a good way of having a memory about what you agreed to, but it's not going to enforce your agreement. And so it's fine to write it all down so that nobody forgets, but at the same time, it's not going to be something that you can take to court. And so I've always believed in that since then, and have believed in people. And so even to this day, I'm working with colleagues that are on the opposite side of the world from me. And the reason I'm still working with them, and I've been working with them since 2002, is because at about that time, my partner called me up, and he had 8 employees in Saudi Arabia, and they were trapped, and they didn't have enough. He didn't have enough money to pay them their salaries, but he also didn't have enough money to even let them leave Saudi Arabia or travel at all within the country. So he called me up and he said he had this problem. And it happened that I was at that time making a good income. And so I said, okay, I'll send you $50,000. And I did that day. I sent him $50,000 cash by wire, and that literally saved his company. And that was in about 2003. And in 2017, he sold a portion of that company for $50 million. And so that had a very good outcome. And because of that fact that we never signed any contract or had any formal writing of any kind other than me going to the bank and putting the wire transfer in. But he's always stuck with me since then. And though I didn't get any part of the $50 million, and there's lots of reasons for that, I have gotten recompense many times and in many ways. And so we're still working together. And the interesting thing is that in 2017, he sold the software of the company that we were involved with for this $50 million. And after 3 years, the party that bought the software failed to pay royalties, stopped paying royalties. And so there was a provision in the contract that allowed us to take the software back. So this is a software that we had sold, or he had sold, for $50 million. And then we've taken it back because they haven't been paying the royalties. And so now we can continue to do business based on that same software with that known value. And through all of that, we've been friends in relationship, and we have these golden threads between us, but you can never find any documentation of it. It's entirely it's not even an understanding. It's a connection between us that can never be broken. And so this is a man who I have complete faith in. And a lot of people trust him and rely on him. And, I have no doubt that trust is properly placed. And so I continue to work with him every day. I have work in front of me right now on my desk that I'm working with him. But in terms of a contract, the written contracts are nothing in international business. If you don't trust the people you're working with, then you've got a problem, serious problem. And that's probably true of business within the country as well. So Mekdi says, I respect people who want to stay anonymous on the internet. Personally, I took this stance in response to the surveillance civilization we're in, as opposed to what I did in early internet. Yeah, okay, each to his own. if you think your information is safe from the surveillance civilization, then you're actually foolish. Or I presume that everything I do and say is being monitored and recorded by my government, and I just assume that's the case, and it makes it a lot easier. Its most colorful, Cool says it's most colorfully portrayed in Greek mythology as the magical thread that Ariadne gave to Theseus, assisting him in his heroic journey into and out of the Minotaur's cave. Yeah, that's a colorful analogy, and you're quite right about that. Okay, so let me go on. Let's see where I am here. So I'm reading from The Mystical Path Less Traveled, a Jungian Psychological Perspective by Jerry Wright. Here's what Dr. Wright says. When the divine is located within matter, within nature, and within our human nature, we are the embodiment, the instrument, the conduit of divinity, everywhere and all of the time. We have the power to heal or to hurt, to create or to destroy, to love or hate, and to connect or divide. We are then full-time religious beings. Every decision is a religious, spiritual decision. Every person we meet presents an image of the divine, whether or not the person has that self-identification. With that orientation, that worldview and self-view, we are empowered because we have the resources to draw on regardless of the situation. We have the power of divinity itself. We have the responsibility to co-create the future. And yes, we have the power to destroy as well. Some have the notion, the fear, that if there were no theistic God, then we could act as we please, and there would be no reason to act ethically. Actually, the opposite is the case. As conduits of divinity, we would bear more responsibility to behave ethically and compassionately. We must allow our theistic and monotheistic notions of God to die so that we can claim our birthright as conduits of divinity, rather than as worshipers of an external divinity. So I wholly agree with that. I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to talk about this for a moment. Just let me put the date so I can remember next week what we're talking about. So today is 3/21/21. And so the point is that, some religions are ahead of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. For example, the Indian religions, if you fly on an Indian airplane, the cabin attendants will bow to you like this when you enter the airplane. And they're doing that because they're bowing to the divinity that is within you. And, and they do it with every individual. And regardless of whether they physically know you or actually know anything about you, but they're bowing to the the piece of the collective unconscious that is within you and that you represent. And so in that respect, they're far ahead of the Western religions, because, of course, in Christianity, just to name one, we have divided up Protestantism into something like 400 different branches. And boy, if you're not part of my branch, then you're going to hell. That's the way we behave toward people. And, that's not true at all. And it's a terrible thing to say to people. And and we have to, our religious traditions have been back to back for thousands of years. We've said my side is right, your side is wrong, type thing in the West. And, even in India that happens, but on a sort of lesser scale, let's say. And so I'm an American because my Dutch ancestors left Holland to escape the 80 Years' War, which lasted until 1648. And my ancestors finally got fed up enough with the war, which happened all those years, where the Spanish Catholics were trying to make the Protestant Calvinist Dutch back into good Catholics, killing lots of people in the process. But, why? Okay, now my best friend, some of my best friends in the world are Catholic. And so it's a question of, after being back to back, we need to be face to face and see how we can benefit from other religious traditions and other ideas about religion. So I'll look at your comments here, and then I'm going to call today's session to a halt, because I've been talking for 2.5 hours and I'm starting to lose my voice as usual. That's how I know when to stop. But so Makepeace says, I love Gospel of Thomas in that sense. His disciples said to him, when will the kingdom come? And Jesus said, it will not come by waiting for it. It will not be a matter of saying, here it is, or there it is. Rather, the kingdom of the Father is spread upon the earth, and men do not see it. Absolutely. Heaven is spread upon the earth, and men do not see it. And going on, a man said to him, tell my brothers to divide my father's possessions with me. He said to him, oh man, who has made me a divider? And he turned to his disciples and said to them, I am not a divider, am I? And that's worth knowing, because we've seen the extreme of how our politicians can try to divide us, but I see my fellow Americans as Americans, not as somebody who is wrong because they don't believe it as I do. And who knows, maybe some of them will change their belief based on something they hear on one of these videos. So it's not for me to divide the country. And this is the fundamental mistake of our former president. And it's why he won't be reelected in 2024, and why many of his followers who put their energy behind the wrong man are going to spend years in prison, maybe decades in prison. And so they'll have lots of time to think about it. Yeah. Okay. So, Brad, thank you for your compliment. As I said, I try not to read such compliments. But anyway, thank you for joining me today. We've been reading from The Unseen Partner, Love and Longing in the Unconscious by Diane Croft. And we've also been reading from Mystical Path Less Traveled, a Jungian Psychological Perspective by Jerry Wright. This book is published by Chiron Publications. And so Diane Croft's book you can buy directly from her, which she would probably appreciate, at a website called theunseenpartner.com. But it's also available on Amazon. And Jerry Wright's book, The Mystical Path Less Traveled, is also available on Amazon, but you can buy it directly from Chiron Publications. And my practice is to always buy directly from the source if I can, because obviously you probably spend the same amount at Amazon, but the author doesn't earn as much from the publication as they do if you buy it directly from them. So I try to buy directly. So Jerry Wright's book, A Mystical Path Less Traveled, published by Chiron, CHIRON Publications, and Diane Croft's book is published by Interleaf, but you can buy it directly from Diane at theunseenpartner.com. Penelope says the U.S.A. are having its Pluto return and Chiron return upcoming. It is clearing the past and healing the hypersensitivity. Well, that's good. Thank you. I wish you would keep politics out of your live stream, says Silver. Well, you know, there's no keeping politics out of any of these topics, because they're all political, and politics is in everything. Okay, let me address that. When I was active in the Marines, I often had young Marines come to me and say, well, I'll do you anything you want me to do, sir, and I'll do it the best I can, but please don't involve me in the politics. And the problem is that everything is politics, and you have to understand that, and then you have to behave accordingly. And so, you know, you can follow orders up to a point in the U.S. military. You know, they're very strong statistics on the MBTI that said 95% of all generals and admirals are STJ, sensing, thinking, judgmental. And and I would say that's true. And these are all guys who say, what shall I do? And you say, well, take your destroyer and go out over that horizon and kill that person, and then come back, report back. And so the captain of the ship takes the ship out over the horizon. Aye, aye, sir. Does the mission, comes back and said, what can I do next? But those guys never get over 2 stars, okay? Because if you're too much that way, if you're too much of an STJ,
very logic oriented, very detail oriented, and very judgmental, you're not going to get up to the top ranks to 3 and 4 stars. So the people who do are people like Colin Powell, who was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then he was Secretary of State, and so on. And those people have learned how to work the politics of the military so that they're survivable. And Colin Powell is a Black man, and he came out of West Point and served through his whole career having to manage the issue of being a Black man in a largely white service at the time. But he did it brilliantly, and he did it politically. And the result of that was he became the top military officer in the country at one point. And today we have the Secretary of Defense is a Black man, and he too had to navigate all those racial issues in addition to all the other issues that we face in our lives. And so, you know, if anything, if I can give you any advice for your life that would be important to you, is to start to understand that everything is political, everything. You know, when you go to church and your pastor is telling you a narrative of some kind, he's being political. He's hoping that you will believe his story, and that's a very political thing, regardless of what religion they're in. And so, and you know, I have to admit that I'm political. Everything about this YouTube channel is political because it's the politics between the Jungians and the Freudians, and the Freudians are about reductionism and bringing everything down to something that's provable by statistics. But provable by statistics isn't where we live. We live in the eros, not in the logos. And so I'm not, you know, I don't care if you believe in Jungian psychology, honestly, you know, it's your life. But the reality is that Dr. Jung figured out how the psyche really works, not how some statistician tells you it works. And the statisticians are using facts. Yes, they're using facts, but sometimes you get those facts wrong. And so one of the warnings that we've had in the last week is that even if you get vaccinated, as I have fortunately been, you can still get COVID. And so, you know, you can stop wearing your mask all you want as a political statement, if that's what you want to do. But, you know, when we say that the Moderna or Pfizer vaccine is 95% effective, it means that there's 5% that are still going to get COVID even after being vaccinated. And if you're one of the unlucky 5%, then you made the wrong political choice. And so we all have to continue to be careful and keep our health. Silver Cardina says, I guess I disagree with you on your politics, but I like your other content. Well, you know, that's the way it is. That's fair enough. You know, I don't expect everybody to be exactly like me, but I expect my fellow Americans to be Americans and not be tribal, okay? Because tribalism is is regressive. It's going back in time. And if we're going to make progress in the world, we have to find ways to work together, even if we don't agree with one another. And, you know, when I was in high school, the Kingston Trio had a song called the Mary Minuet. And I don't have much of a singing voice, but I think I can tell you at least a part of the lyrics even today. It goes something like this. They're rioting in Africa, they're starving in Spain, there are hurricanes in Florida, and Texas needs rain. The whole world is festering with unhappy souls. The French hate the Germans hate the Poles. Italians hate Yugoslavs, South Africans hate the Dutch, and I don't like anybody very much. But we can be thankful and tranquil and proud, for man's been endowed with a mushroom-shaped cloud. And we know for certain that some lovely day, someone will set the spark off and we will all be blown away. And it goes on from there, but the point is well taken that, you know, we can all find flaws in our fellow human beings. But if we don't find our likeness, and soon, we're going to have very unfortunate results. And that. I'll just leave Nikki's comment for now. So Danny says, secular talk is my favorite political YouTube chat. And fair enough. And, you know, everything that I'm doing is political. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I'm reading Jerry Wright's book, and Jerry Wright, you know, explicitly says that he's deconstructing Abrahamic religions from the top down, and he's right. And obviously, anybody that's a faithful believer that just believes by faith, you know, they're not going to like what he says, but reality is something different. And so when you know, as Jerry Wright says about himself, as he writes this, we know that we are the conduits of divinity in a sense, and in this sense. And we have to look at how all these belief systems have caused horrible suffering throughout the centuries and the millennia, and finally realize that here we stand on one planet, one little blue dot in the universe, and we know of nowhere else where there is life, nowhere as of yet. And we have we can envision life from someplace else. We can have TV programs about it. But the reality is we're it, okay? Regardless of what our nationality is, whatever, regardless of what our political persuasion is. And now that we can all talk to one another and communicate with one another, then we have to get serious about thinking how we're going to resolve our situation. And so my friend Vivian sent me something that she wanted me to do last week, and I didn't get to it for some reason. So I just want to assure you that I'll take care of that, hopefully in the next day or so. Brad says, is ego wishing something other than it is ego? I don't know, that's semantics, but ego is your conscious mind. And the self is in the unconscious mind. And so you might have a perception and know that yourself is controlling your life, but you probably can never make all those aspects of your life conscious. He says, Zen teachings help me with the balance of that particular issue. Yeah, I'll give you an example of that. I lived in Japan for many years, as you probably know. And one time I took a weekend class in Zen to understand what it was about. And so I asked the teacher, what is Zen about? And they said, well, you know, when you're learning to ride a bicycle, you have to learn to balance and to steer and to pedal. And as long as you have to think about those things, you can't ride a bicycle. But as soon as you can forget those things and just do it, then you can ride a bicycle. And all of this is about that, really. In other words, you can learn all the facts. You can listen to all 1,100 of my videos that are on this YouTube channel, but still not grok it unless you actually do grok it. And so it's not a question of belief or believing me. It's a question of knowing what the truth is. And that's something that you have to do within yourself. It's like riding a bicycle. So as my wife, who's the Buddhist teacher, says, you can take people up to the edge of the cliff, but they have to step over. You know, it's like the fool card in Chiron, where the fool is stepping off the cliff. We all have to make a leap. And you can call it a leap of faith in the sense that in any religion, you build up what you know about the religion. And so, okay, theoretically, in the early days, you're a believer because your parents are believers. So they go, I ought to be a believer too. But until you get beyond belief, so that you know, I can believe in steering and balancing and pedaling for bicycle riding, but until I actually do it and can forget about those things, then I can do it. And religion is like that. And another example is typing. Most of us are touch typers today because we use the internet so much. And so we use our computers so much. And so we're all keyboarding. But as you probably remember from your own experiences of learning to keyboard, as long as you have to think about where the keys are, that you can't do it. And to this day, I probably could not diagram a QWERTY keyboard without looking at one. And so as long as you have to think about where those keys are, you can't type. It's only when you can forget about where the keys are and just do it that you can type. And so there are many things in life like that, but one of those things is getting in touch with the divine. As long as you have to learn somebody else's book and listen to somebody else's teaching, you're not there yet. And so as long as you have to listen to me reading books about individuation, you're not individuated yet. And once you get there, then you don't need me anymore. Then you know. And all I can do is tell you what's helped me to get to that point. That's the idea anyway. So Silver Cardina says, I'm a former Democrat. I don't think the Democrats are self-critical enough. Well, we certainly are self-critical. I'm self-critical. But as an American, we have to be self-critical about what happens wrongly in our country. And in terms of what happens wrongly, allowing Wall Street and the 1% to control our politics through spending billions on political advertising and through religions that are not religions, really. They're just propaganda arms. That's not critical enough either. And we need to understand what it is that we should be critical of in order to balance our entire society. And that's going to take tens of years, if not hundreds of years. But as long as we can lead people by having an airplane with our name on it, and that suggests that we're godlike, no, that's not right. And so, over the last year, the people who said that COVID wasn't real, there are now hundreds of those people who actually died from it. And so, we have to understand what's real and what is not real, and act accordingly. And the best we can do, we hire a government to protect us from things like pandemics, and the American government failed at that miserably last year, and we're trying to play catch up to save our society now. And that's the way it is. But we have to pay attention to our science and so on, but then we have to make a sensible decision. And let's see. Yeah, as Penelope says, we're quite barbaric. We need to become aware of our thinking. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Danny says Bernie Sanders had good ideas, but is too soft. The left in the U.S. needs more of a fighter. Yeah, I think we're starting to get a few fighters in there. I acknowledge that Bernie, wasn't as powerful as his competitors were in terms of being strong enough to lead a movement. He persuaded a lot of Americans, but not enough. And so we need to persuade enough. Big Cat says, sorry, Trump is awful. I don't understand how so many have been hornswoggled by him. Well, I don't understand it either, but I know it's human nature, and I can see how it happens from being informed with Jungian psychology. And, until we become more conscious of what's happening to us and how we're being manipulated by the television, and I admit it's manipulated by both sides, but we have to make sensible decisions one by one. Each one of us has to make sensible decisions. So it means we all have to have enough discernment to know what is BS and what is not BS. And, saying something, our former president was saying the pandemic was fake news all of last year. And the irony is that now a part of Mar-a-Lago has been shut down because it's a health hazard. And so, these things do come around. The point of Jungian psychology is that each of us have to get enough information so that we can know about these things. We don't have to be told. We don't have to be persuaded. We can recognize when people are trying to persuade us as opposed to believing and understanding. And it's the example is the abortion issue, which is a very divisive issue, of course. But to understand the reality, we have to understand that when we had illegal abortion before Roe v. Wade, things were pretty awful in the United States. I mean, we had 15% of our medical community committing felonies, for one thing, and we still had lots and lots of abortions. Both my two grandmothers combined, and these were Victorian women who were born in the 19th century. They were both 19th century women. Both had, between them, they had 5 illegal abortions. And so to think that if we ban abortion, we're going to stop abortions is just ludicrous. And we learned this lesson once, but unfortunately, it keeps rearing its ugly head. And the reality is we have to come up with conditions in our society where women are forced to consider abortion as a decision. And my grandmothers weren't they weren't promiscuous, and they were actually aborting fetuses that came from their own marriages. So fortunately, in both cases, I'm descended from the children that they did bring into the world, but they, I had great uncles and great aunts who never made it into life. And so thinking that we can stop abortion by banning it is not the answer. And all we will do is brutalize our society once again. It was quite horrible before Roe v. Wade, and it will become quite horrible again if we ban abortion and don't do it in a proper way. And so, until we learn that lesson, it's going to be a divisive issue, and we just have to know how we're being manipulated. Of course, nobody wants to have an abortion. I don't want anybody to have abortions, and I certainly didn't want my daughters to have abortions, which, as far as I know, they didn't. But that doesn't mean I think it should be illegal. And because of what it did do to society to have it illegal, and that's going to happen again. And my prophecy is that if the powers that keep trying to make it illegal succeed, then we're going to be back to the same awful story that we had before. And young people below 40 years old, or maybe even 45 years old now, don't remember those things, but go to Turner Classic Movies and watch Dirty Dancing, or In the Heat of the Night. Those two movies address abortion in a very serious way, and addressed what it was doing to our society. And so try to understand what it is that it did do to our society before it was made legal, and you'll understand what the issues are. Right. Danny says abortion isn't a nice thing, but not allowing abortion is even worse. Precisely. Just think of what it must have done to my two grandmothers not to have appropriate birth control, which meant that they had to abort their fetuses instead of preventing those pregnancies in the first place. Penelope says, and people have to have a choice of abortion after rape. I absolutely agree with that, because I can't think of anything much worse than having one of my daughters being forced to raise the child of someone who attacked her. That's a horrible prospect. And so anyway, thank you everyone for being here, and I'll be on next week at the same time, 8 a.m. Sundays, and we will go on with the reading of The Unseen Partner and The Mystical Path Less Traveled. These are the books: The Unseen Partner and The Mystical Path Less Traveled. So looking at Jungian psychology from an Eros point of view and a Logos point of view. Thank you for joining me today, and see you again soon.